Okay, welcome back, folks. Missed you last week. As I told you, I had a doctor's appointment, but we're back again today, and we're going to talk a little bit more about the American Civil War. We are into the first year. Actually, we're going to finish the first year. The first year didn't have a lot of battles. Last 2 weeks ago, we saw the Battle of Bull Run, or Manassas, as it's called uh, in the South. But today, we're going to finish up the war in 1861 because, again, there's not a lot that happens after the Battle of Bull Run because both sides are kind of shocked. They didn't, they both thought the war was going to be really quick and fast and it was going to be over. Of course, we know better now. It lasted for 4 years at the cost of uh, practically over two-thirds of a million lives. So it was definitely not a fast and bloodless war. Well, let's kind of review what we talked about 2 weeks ago. We looked at the aftermath of the Battle of Bull Run, and we saw how both sides uh, pretty well realized that, like I said, the war was going to be really long and bloody. Lincoln responded with the defeat at Bull Run by getting rid of the general, Irwin McDowell, and replacing him with George McClellan. Now, we talked a lot about George McClellan. George McClellan on paper was the absolute perfect soldier. He was young, he was brilliant, he was a charismatic leader. His troops loved him. He had everything going for him, except for a couple of problems. Number one, he was as narcissistic as you could believe anybody could ever be. And number two, he didn't want to fight. He wanted to have this beautiful big army, but he forgot that the whole purpose of having an army was to go to war. And he just didn't want to fight. We then reviewed how Washington, D.C., because of the closeness of the battle, uh, decided they needed to really fortify. They went on a kick of fortifying Washington, D.C. So by the end of the war, Washington, D.C. was probably the most fortified city in the world. I mean, it literally had a fort on every corner practically. We also saw how West Virginia was created when it broke away. 50 of the northwestern states broke away from the state of Virginia to become what was called West Virginia. It didn't wasn't created as a state until 1863, but it definitely was a state. We also saw how Congress, and a couple of times, tried to kind of stop the war. The first one actually occurred before the Battle of Bull Run and before Lincoln actually even took his inauguration. They passed what was called the Corwin Amendment, and the Corwin Amendment would have forbid the U.S. from ever abolishing slavery. And I told you that obviously it never passed; it was never ratified by the necessary three-fourths of the states. But the ironic thing is, it's actually still out there on the books. There is not a sunset clause on the Corwin Amendment. Obviously, that's never going to happen, but it's there. And then they also passed what was called the Johnson Crittenden Resolutions, which was kind of a War Aims Act. And that was passed after Bull Run. And Congress passed a resolution telling the South, hey, we don't intend to do away with slavery. All we want to do is reunite the Union. Well, I think both sides probably figured that out, that wasn't going to be the real case because obviously there was enough pressure from the abolitionists in the North that wasn't going to happen. And on top of that, the South didn't believe them anyway. So that was what we talked about 2 weeks ago. Now, after the Battle of Bull Run, the focus kind of shifts to the Western theater of the United States. You can kind of divide the Civil War battles into the Western theater, that's the areas west of the Appalachian Mountains, and the Eastern theater, which is the area kind of east of the Appalachian Mountains, the original kind of 13 states, as you will. So that was how we kind of look at the Civil War. We have a Western theater of operations and an Eastern theater. After Bull Run, both sides took up defensive positions in the East. They immediately went into defense mode. After the offensive battle of Bull Run, neither one of them wanted to fight again right then. And so, really, for the next 6 months, you see very little action at all. You see some skirmishes and you see some little little battles, but nothing significant, nothing like Bull Run in the rest of the Eastern Theater. For the rest of 1861, both sides are kind of rebuilding and trying to regroup and try to figure out where to go and what to do. There was a couple of important things that occurred out in the Western Theater. So let's look at that. First of all, right after Bull Run, both sides were kind of having trouble with their generals, their staff. Jefferson Davis, just like Lincoln, who had had to fire over McDowell and bring McClellan on board, was having problems with his generals. Remember, the two Confederate generals that were in charge of the Southern troops at the Battle of Bull Run was PGT Beauregard, who was the hero of Fort Sumter, and a man by the name of Joseph Johnston, and both of them have been around for a long time. Both of them were West Point graduates. Both of them had been Army officers for many years in the Federal Army, and it went south when the war broke out. As it turned out, Davis had to take action on both of them. Johnson was absolutely livid with anger when he felt like he had been promoted over by other generals who he outranked. Beauregard, on the other hand, fired off a letter to Davis, basically telling him that the reason the battle wasn't won better than it was because he had failed to give him reinforcements. That really angered Jefferson Davis. He ended up removing Beauregard from the command of the Army of Virginia and sent him west to serve under Albert Sidney Johnston. So Beauregard spends most of the rest of the Civil War out in the West. He does come back towards the end of the Civil War, but at least in the most of the Civil War from this point on, he served out west. The Union Army out west was kind of a mess also. It originally had been under the command of John C. Fremont. He was in charge of the whole Western Theater Army. Now, I don't want to get into too much detail about John C. Fremont, but if you've been with me in the past, when we talked about the American West, John C. Fremont was kind of a legend in his own mind. And by that, what I mean is that basically Fremont, he really never had done the things that he supposedly was famous for. He was called the Pathfinder for finding all these routes in the West, when actually it was Kit Carson that did most of that. He was in charge of the army out in the, he was in charge of a big plantation, if you will, out in California at the gold strike, and ended up somehow losing it all. He was in charge of a railroad and it went bankrupt. He really wasn't good at anything except promoting himself. So John C. Fremont was kind of having a problem doing much of anything. On top of that, he decided, he was an abolitionist to the core. He decided he was going to issue an order basically emancipating all the slaves in Missouri. And Lincoln just went apoplectic over this, because that was the last thing that Lincoln wanted to do right then at the beginning of the war, was anger the population of states like Missouri and Kentucky. He was fighting like the devil to keep them in the Union. And here is Fremont issuing a premature order of emancipation, which he had no business doing in the beginning. He didn't have the authority to do that. Lincoln, as a result, basically removed him from power out west and replaced him with two men, General Henry Halleck in the west, the western sector, basically Missouri, Tennessee, western Kentucky, western Tennessee, that area, and a man by the name of General Don Carlos Buell over in the eastern sector, particularly that area of eastern and western Kentucky, where the population was pretty pro-Union, even in Tennessee. The South, in the meanwhile, had another commander under Albert Sidney Johnston. Albert Sidney Johnston was the head of the army, the Confederate Army, in the whole Western theater. And he had under his command a man by the name of General Leonidas Polk. He's sometimes called the Fighting Parson, because before he was a general in the Confederate Army, he was a clergyman. He was kind of one of these political generals that we'll be talking about. Polk was assigned to block the Mississippi River south of Columbus, Kentucky, because they realized that that was an important thing to do to keep the Union uh, boats from heading down the Mississippi and Ohio River and the Missouri River to come into the western part of the Confederacy. Henry Halleck, in turn, assigns the defense of that area around Cairo, Missouri, to a man by the name of Ulysses S. Grant, who at the beginning of the war was, I mean, literally a nobody. You know, nobody really knew that much about General Grant except he had been an alcoholic out west in the 50s, and he basically had to resign. Other than that, Grant was kind of one of these officers that nobody paid attention to. Obviously, by the end of the war, he became an extremely important person to the Union Army. So let's look at Albert Sidney Johnston, Henry Halleck, and Don Carlos Buell. First of all, this is Albert Sidney Johnston. Albert Sidney Johnston was maybe the best general that the South had at the beginning of the war. Now, everybody thinks Robert E. Lee was, from the very start, the biggest general. Robert E. Lee actually did not go into combat until the latter half of 1861. Albert Sidney Johnston was the man. He was absolutely the favored general of Jefferson Davis. They had been classmates at West Point. They were good friends. And frankly, Johnston was one of the most experienced combat officers in the whole Army at the outbreak of the war. On either side, he had fought in the Black Hawk War. He was Secretary of the War of the Republic of Texas before it became a state. He fought in the Mexican War. He fought what was called the Mormon War. He had seen action out in Bleeding, Kansas. He was, frankly, folks, he probably had seen as much combat as any general in the Army up to the beginning of the Civil War. And he was a good officer. He was excellent. He joined the Confederacy. Again, he was a Kentuckian and he was a slave owner. And so he joined the Confederacy, and he was placed in charge of the whole Western Department, which basically stretched from the Appalachian Mountains to the Ozark Mountains. About a 500-mile swath there. And he set up a defensive line in Tennessee, which was basically designed to keep the North from invading the South out in the Western Theater. Like I said, he was absolutely considered to be the best Army officer in the South. Even Lee said that. Lee admittedly had said at the beginning of the war that he was absolutely the best combat officer that the South had. He was brave, he was analytical, he was organized, he had strong command of tactics and strategy. He had absolutely everything going for him. Unfortunately, he had the misfortune to be killed in combat at the Battle of Shiloh, which was right at the beginning of 1860, or about the middle part of 1861. Ended up being an incalculable loss to the South. A lot of people that have studied the Civil War in depth have said that if Johnston would have survived, he ultimately probably would have been put in charge of the whole Confederate Army, and there's no telling what would have happened had he been, and he survived the Battle of Shiloh, but he did not. And we'll talk about that when we get to the Battle of Shiloh. Now, on the Union side, you can't say quite as much about the two Union officers that replaced John C. Fremont out west. Henry Halleck, again, was one of these great desk officers, and that's what he was. He had been an absolute genius at West Point. He had studied under a man by the name of Dennis Hart Mahan, who was kind of the premier military theorist of the world in the 1830s and 40s and 50s. He was so brilliant that he was actually allowed to teach classes while he was still a cadet. That's pretty much unheard of, folks, even at West Point. It just, his nickname was Old Brains. That's how intelligent the guy was. He had written books after book after book. On one of them was The Elements of Military Art and Science, which served as a text at West Point, and it's my understanding it is still used to some degree as a textbook. So, I mean, this guy was a brilliant desk officer. The problem was he felt more comfortable behind a desk than he had out in the battlefield. Big difference, you know. After serving the Mexican War, where he played a pretty important part, but again, not all that big. Uh, he went out west and had a really important part to play in the statehood of California in the 1850s. And when the Civil War broke out, he chose to fight for the Union, even though he was kind of a Southern sympathizer. He kind of sympathized with the South, but he felt like, you know, he needed to fight. He had been in the Union Army his whole life, and he felt like he needed to stay with it. The problem was he was an extremely cautious general. He believed in thorough preparations. He believed in defensive fortifications, and he was absolutely a genius in administration and logistics and politics. In other words, he was great behind the desk. He just wasn't very good at fighting. And again, that's the problem with the Union Army in the beginning, is finding someone that would fight. As a result, he would resist orders, offering advice instead of offering advice instead. He allowed him to take praise for the actions of others, or if it failed, you know, he would basically blame everything on them. So as a result, he wasn't really trusted very much by his subordinates. And even though he had allowed Grant to come on his staff when others didn't, he really didn't trust the guy. And he and Grant had a really uncomfortable relationship during the war. And as you will see when we get into 1861, 1862, basically Halleck and Grant don't get along very well at all. You know, so that's Henry Halleck. He was in charge of the Union forces in Missouri, Arkansas, the western part of Kentucky and Tennessee. The man on the eastern sector of the Western Theater was a man by the name of Major General Don Carlos Buell. Now, Don Carlos Buell was in Ohio. He wasn't very well known. He was, you know, he went to West Point. He was kind of a mediocre student. He had seen service, you know, in the Seminole Wars, the Mexican War. Nothing really big. You know, he never really played a big combat role. His main success was that he was a very good friend of General George McClellan. And when McClellan is appointed the head of the whole Union Army, when you know, when he replaces, okay, mind slipped me here. When he replaced the old legend, he basically was sent west to take charge of that sector of the Union Army. And he does a good job as far as whipping the army up into shape. He's just like McClellan. He's real good at getting the army organized. He's just not very good at using it. Lincoln had a saying about both McClellan and Don Carlos Buell. He said they had a bad case of the slows. Think about it. You know, if you're an old person, you probably know what it means when you have a bad case of the runs. Well, you know, Don Carlos Buell and McClellan, in Lincoln's estimation, had a bad case of the slows. That's what Lincoln said about him. But nevertheless, you know, he performed admirably, you know, in the battles that he was in out west, Shiloh, Corinth, you know, and he ended up sharing control of the West with Grant when Halleck eventually moves east, because eventually Halleck is going to be taken east and put in charge of the whole army when McClellan is replaced. But that takes a little while to happen. McClellan was not very well liked by his men. He was kind of personally brave. Nobody ever questioned his bravery, but he just really didn't feel much like getting involved in battle, you know. And the result was that his troops really didn't care much for him. So you've got basically you've got Albert Sidney Johnston in charge of the Southern forces stretching across the southern part of Tennessee into North Carolina and South Carolina. And you've got the Union forces split between Halleck in the west and Don Carlos Buell in the eastern part of the Western Theater. Now, in August, about a few weeks after the Battle of Bull Run, the second large battle of the Civil War in 1861 is fought, and that is the Battle of Wilson's Creek, August 10th, 1861. Now, if you've been with me in the past, you know that I grew up in a stone's throw from the Battle of Wilson's Creek. That was my playground when I was a kid. I rode my bike out there before it was ever a national park and used to ride around that place. And, it was just, literally 2 or 3 miles from my house. So I grew up basically knowing just about everything that you could possibly know about the Battle of Wilson's Creek. So let's talk a little bit about the Battle of Wilson's Creek. As we've said, Lincoln was critically important. He viewed Missouri as critically important because it controlled the Ohio River and the Mississippi River and the Missouri River. It all comes together right there on the eastern border of Missouri. And so he knew that that was a critical state. On top of that, it had a huge population. And so, that he could draw from, particularly German and Irish, which were basically very pro-Union. So he initially does everything he can to keep Missouri into the Union camp. As we've said, he initially put John C. Fremont in charge. And so Fremont orders Nathaniel Lyon to come east from Kansas. They are scared that the arsenal in St. Louis at Fort Jackson Jackson Barracks is going to be seized by the South. And so he orders Nathaniel Lyon to come east to basically secure the arsenal in St. Louis. When Nathaniel Lyon gets there, he does just exactly what he's supposed to do and seizes the arsenal, gets the weapons out of the hands so it won't be able to be grabbed by the Southerners. And then he asks basically if he can head south to intercept the Missouri militia. The Missouri militia has formed under a man by the name of General Sterling Price, who was the former governor of Missouri, and he was very much a Southerner. And the militia had, basically was composed of Southern-leaning soldiers. And so the militia had fled St. Louis and Jefferson City, pardon me here, at the beginning of the war and gone in the western part of the state. And Fremont and Lyon had figured out that there was a large Confederate army coming north under the command of Ben McCulloch. And they were worried that if those two got together, that they could possibly threaten St. Louis, which was critical to saving Missouri for the Union. And so Fremont tells Lyon, yes, go south, try to intercept Sterling Price's Missouri militia and keep them from combining with Ben McCulloch's Confederate army. So that's what happens. Eventually, there's a small battle at Carthage between some of Lyon's forces. Lyon's not there. It's fought by Franz Sigel, who's a German we'll hear more about in a minute. Anyway, he fights a small battle at Carthage. And then, of course, the two would finally end up combining and meeting right outside of Springfield, about 10 miles southwest of Springfield at that time, at Wilson's Creek on August 10th, 1861. Now, Wilson's Creek is kind of a small battle in retrospect. But remember, it's only the second really big battle of the Civil War in 1861, other than the Battle of Bull Run. Bull Run was a lot larger. But the Battle of Wilson's Creek was a critically important battle for a couple of reasons. Number one, Missouri was basically saved for the Union by the Battle of Wilson's Creek, even though the South technically won the battle. We'll see that in a minute. Second of all, it was a pretty bloody engagement. Even though there weren't a lot of soldiers, the Southerners had 10 to 12,000. The Union Army had about 7 or 8,000, which is really, in comparison to some of the other battles of the Civil War, pretty small. But the casualty rate was just extremely high. like 20-some% on both sides, which is really, folks, a really high casualty rate in the Civil War, even. Uh, they fought for about 6 hours in the morning uh, on August 10th. Remember, this is the middle of summer. Uh, I just got in talking to some of the people sitting down in Springfield. It's really, really hot and humid in Springfield right now. Uh, it was really hot and humid at Wilson's Creek on the 10th of August. Can you imagine fighting for 6 hours in that kind of weather? And that's exactly what they were doing. They were fighting in hot, humid weather. It was just a terribly hard battle to fight. But nevertheless, they end up fighting for about 6 hours. Uh, I don't want to get into a great detail about the Battle of Wilson's Creek because I could talk about this for about 3 or 4 days. But basically, what happened was Lyon's forces came out of the north and the west. The first engagement happened in a place called Ray's Cornfield on the side of what's called the Old Wire Road, which is the telegraph road between St. Louis and Fort Smith. This is Wilson's Creek here. Price's army, the Missouri militia, had set up camp on the western side of Wilson's Creek, and McCullough's Confederate army had set up camp on the eastern side. They end up getting in a big fight at Bloody Hill, where a lot of the casualties happened. I told you that a German officer by the name of Franz Sigel, who you will hear more about in the Civil War, had been put in charge of a part of the army under Lyon. And he had talked Lyon into let him make a maneuver to go around and basically do what's called a concentric move to come around behind the Confederate forces and try to catch them in a pincher move to keep, he blocked the Old Wire Road to keep them from retreating and to keep reserves from coming up. It was a brilliant move. And folks, it actually began working really well until what happened was that McCullough, upon learning about Sigel being down there, sent his Louisiana brigade down, who were dressed in gray uniforms. They were called the Pelican Division. Well, Sigel saw them coming. Remember, Sigel's a German, and most of his troops are St. Louis German soldiers. A lot of them could not speak English. Sigel sees them coming, but he mistakes them for the 2nd Iowa Division, who also wore gray uniforms at the beginning of the war. And he thinks that he is linking up with some of Lyon's soldiers. The result is, by the time he realized it, it was too late, and they absolutely massacre Sigel's army. I mean, like 1/4 of the Union Army is just decimated by the Southern Army. Sigel tried to give commands, but by that time it was too late. And on top of that, some of the subordinate commanders couldn't speak German, and the army couldn't hear anything but German, and it was just an absolute disaster, folks. I'll be honest; it was not a good way to start the Battle of Wilson's Creek. The result was that the Southern Army wins the battle. Nathaniel Lyon is killed at the battle. He is the first Union general killed in the Civil War at the Battle of Wilson's Creek. If you go there, they have tried to restore the Wilson's Creek battleground to a what they call a pristine situation, where when you go there, you hope to be able to see the battlefield as it was on the day of the battle. They're a long ways from getting that accomplished, but it's better than having a bunch of statues and buildings and things like that. The only standing building at the Battle of Wilson, at the battlefield on Wilson's Creek that was there the day of the battle is called the Ray House, which was on the Old Wire Road. And this is the Ray House as it stands today. So, again, I'll probably talk more about the Battle of Wilson's Creek than it deserves, but, you know, I've got a soft spot in my heart for it because that's where I grew up. So I kind of know a lot about it. Well, the Battle of Wilson's Creek was technically a Confederate victory. But McCullough, just like the other generals at the beginning of the war, failed to pursue their victory. That turns out making the Battle of Wilson's Creek what's called a Pyrrhic victory. That's an old term that means you win the war, you win the battle, but at such great cost you don't get anything out of it. And that's exactly what happened. They won the battle, but they really didn't win anything. Casualties, like I said, were amongst the highest of any Civil War battle. percentage-wise in the Civil War. In the Union, it was 24%, with 258 killed, 873 wounded, and most of those died, folks, I'll be honest, and 186 captured, for a total of about 1,300 plus. The Confederate casualties were much smaller percentage-wise because they had about twice as many troops, but they had more people dead and more people wounded. Again, most of those died for a total of about 1,230. So it was not a good battle in terms of the number of casualty rates. Most of the wounded, like I said, ended up dying. They never made it. Most of them were buried in primitive and crude sinkholes. The Ozarks are noted for their sinkholes, and there were lots of them on the battlefield. And so they just threw the bodies in the sinkholes, Union and Confederate alike. Later on, after the war was over, they did dig most of the bodies up and transfer them and rebury them at a national cemetery. By the way, the National Cemetery in Springfield was a divided cemetery in the beginning. One half of it was Southern, one half of it was Union. In 1911, they broke through the wall between the two cemeteries, making it the first national cemetery in the United States where the Union and Southern troops, in a sense, were buried together. So that's kind of an interesting thing. Early Sunday morning, August 11th, the Union forces retreat out of Springfield, taking with them gold bullion amounting to about $2 billion. They said it was a wagon train of about 3 miles long. All the civilians that were Union sympathizers left the city for the most part. It was just a huge deal. McCulloch really missed an opportunity to really put a dent on the Union Army, because had he immediately gone into Springfield, he might have been able to really win a big victory, but he didn't. He waited for another day before they finally entered Springfield and took the charge of Springfield. Springfield ended up would go back and forth between the Union and the Confederate armies for the first couple of years until finally the Union Army kind of took control of it. So what happened after that? This is Ben McCulloch. He's the head of the Southern forces in Springfield and the Ozarks. And this is Sterling Price. He is in charge of the Missouri State Militia, which is allied with the Confederate Army. They kind of work together. Here's the problem. They don't like each other. In fact, the case they can't stand each other. Sterling Price is the commander of the Missouri Militia. He thinks since it's in Missouri, he ought to be in charge. And McCulloch said, no, I'm a Confederate officer. I'm in charge. So they argued. On top of that, Price wanted to take the battle to the Union. He said, what are we waiting around for? Let's get in and go. And McCulloch was kind of like a lot of the other early generals. He didn't want to fight very much. And so he said, no, we're going to kind of consolidate here in Springfield, and we're going to organize and all that stuff. Well, basically Price says, I've had it. That's it. I'm leaving. So Price takes his Missouri State Militia and moves north into what's called Little Dixie. If you don't know anything about Missouri in the Civil War, the southern part of Missouri was basically pro-Union. It doesn't make sense to people outside of Missouri. But the southern part of Missouri had a large Scotch-Irish population and not very many slaves. So the southern part of Missouri was more pro-Union than the central part of Missouri along the Missouri River, which was really a hotbed of sympathy for the South. So much so that it was called Little Dixie. So it's kind of ironic that Price has to move north to try to get to the Southern sympathizers, but that's what he does. He ends up meeting a small Union army at Lexington, Missouri, and they get involved in another fairly good-sized battle. It's often called the Battle of the Hemp Bales or Hay Bales. Hemp wasn't, for a long time, nobody thought hemp was good, so they always talked about the Battle of the Hay Bales. It was really hemp bales. And in it, basically, Price defeats the Union Army again. That forces Lincoln to tell Fremont, get off your rear end, take this huge army that you're sitting in St. Louis with about 40,000 troops and go out there and secure the state of Missouri. So Fremont is forced to go out and take the battlefield. And so he lumbers this big, huge army out to Missouri. Price, realizing he's clearly outnumbered, he only has like a few thousand soldiers. He's thinking, I can't fight this thing. I may be good, but I'm not that good. So he takes off and heads south and begrudgingly ends up combining once again with McCulloch in Arkansas because McCulloch has decided Springfield is defenseless. He looked around and he says, there's no natural defenses in this place. I'm not going to make a stand here. I'm going back to the mountains of northwest Arkansas where I can, have a chance of having a pretty good battle and winning. So McCulloch ends up leaving Missouri and Price ends up moving back to Arkansas and joining with him. The next spring in 1862, they will fight the very important Battle of Pea Ridge in northwest Arkansas, which is the last big battle of what's called the Trans-Mississippi West. So we'll be talking about that when we get to 1862. So in a sense, Wilson Creek is the last gasp of the Confederacy to try to hold on to Missouri. Pea Ridge may be the determining battle, but the Battle of Wilson's Creek kind of basically tells the Confederacy, you're not going to get Missouri. So here's a thing from the Battle of the Hemp Bales. If you go to Lexington, Missouri, there's a very famous courthouse standing there that's still got a cannonball in it. They painted the Battle of Lexington September 18th, 19th through 20th, 1861. You can still see the cannonball embedded in the pillar. So it's kind of a neat thing to see. There were a couple more incidents that occurred that we need to mention real fast. One of them was on the Eastern Theater at Cape Hatteras. Cape Hatteras is part of the Outer Banks of North Carolina. Remember, Winfield Scott, the band I couldn't remember a few minutes ago, Winfield Scott had decided he was going to basically, blockade all the southern ports, which was a great idea and actually ended up having a great effect on the battle. Everybody thought it was kind of stupid in the beginning. They called it the Anaconda Plan because he was going to squeeze the South into submission. Well, the first use of the Anaconda Plan takes place on Cape Hatteras and ends up being a kind of an amphibious landing on a kind of a combined Navy-Army operation. And they seize Cape Hatteras and the Outer Banks of North Carolina, which basically ends up sealing off North Carolina as a port for the rest of the Civil War. So this happened really fast. There wasn't a really big battle there, but it's a critical element of the battle of the war to begin with. And on top of that, like I said, it's kind of the beginning of the use of the Anaconda Plan. The second thing that happened at the end of the war was much more important, and you don't hear about it very much because, frankly, it kind of it wasn't one of Lincoln's finer moments. Lincoln was a great politician, folks. He was honest. He was a masterful orator. He inspired people, but he was not a good military leader in the beginning. He eventually became a good military leader, but he wasn't in the beginning. He was even a worse foreign affairs leader. He had absolutely zero concept of foreign affairs when the war started. He had never been involved in foreign affairs. He knew nothing about it. And something occurred at the end of this 1861, which really showed his naivete and his inexperience. What happened was in November, the USS San Jacinto, which was a United States warship, was out patrolling the oceans on the eastern seaboard. And they intercepted a British mail ship called the RMS Trent, Royal Mail Ship Trent. And they went aboard and searched it, which was, first of all, that was against, since England was a non-combatant and a neutral force, they were not supposed to do that under the rules of warfare. And they went ahead and searched the boat and found a couple of Confederate diplomats, James Mason and John Slidell, who were on the way to London to seek recognition for the Confederacy. The Confederacy really critically wanted Britain and France on their side. And so the commander of the San Jacinto, a man by the name of Charles Wilkes, he sees these two Confederate diplomats. He questions them, find out what they're doing, and he seizes them, which again, folks, is a no-no. You're not supposed to do that kind of thing in international affairs. And so he seizes them, takes them back to the United States, and Lincoln and his cabinet were just elated. They thought, man, this is fantastic. We have just done something really big here. Yeah, they had all right. They absolutely enraged Britain to the point that Britain went on a war footing, sending 8,000 troops to Canada and basically telling America, if you don't straighten up, we're going to go to war. Folks, that's the last thing the Union needed, was to have Britain coming from the north while they're trying to fight the south. On top of that, France said, oh, by the way, we're going to support Britain if they do go to war with you. In other words, it was on the verge of being World War One, long before World War One. Well, luckily, Lincoln sobered up, and some of his advisors, like Charles Sumner and some other guys, got to him and said, you got to stop this real fast, or you're going to have an international war on your hands. And that you can't win an international war. Lincoln sobered up real fast, and he said, hey, let's release these guys, no harm, no foul. They apologized to Britain. They said, we shouldn't have done that. They tucked their tail between their legs and backed out, and, that kind of ended it to a degree. Okay. So 1861 ends. What's the status of the North and the South in 1861 at the end of the year? Well, first of all, both sides had clearly seen that this war was not going to end real fast. True, the South had won the only two big battles that had been fought so far, Bull Run and Wilson's Creek, but they hadn't got a darn thing out of it. They didn't get any territorial gains. They didn't really win anything by winning those two big battles. On top of that, they had not been able to break the border states away from the Union and bring them south, which is what they were trying to do at Wilson's Creek. So there were no real victories there, even though they won the battles. On top of that, Jefferson Davis was just having a horrible time with his generals. I've already mentioned this. When the war broke out after the Battle of Bull Run, he promotes 5 men to the rank of full general. The problem was the 2 men on the last 2 promoted were the most experienced generals he had to some degree, already fighting in the war. P.G.G. Beauregard and Joe Johnson. They had fought a big battle, and they got promoted last. Samuel Cooper was a desk officer. Albert Sidney Johnson was probably the best general, but he hadn't really fought yet. He doesn't really get involved in the big battle of Shiloh. And Robert E. Lee, who will become the best general in the South, has been set behind a desk. He's an engineer. Johnson is absolutely outraged. Joe Johnson. He basically writes a letter to Davis telling him his fame as a soldier and a man has been tarnished. He was really sensitive about being promoted over. This has been a battle with him his whole career. Davis wasn't amused, and those two never got along the rest of the war. Even though John Johnson was a really good general, Davis doesn't use him like he should. Beauregard, as I've already mentioned, basically told Davis, you messed up and didn't send me enough reinforcements. That's why I couldn't follow up for a big victory after Bull Run. And Davis is not happy about that, so he sends him west. So, it's not a good look on the side of the South. But as bad as it was worse in the North. The North, absolutely, folks, at the end of 1861 was just horrible. Lincoln had absolutely had a mess on his hand. He had to get rid of Irwin McDowell. He had to get rid of John C. Fremont, who had a lot of friends in Congress. General Lyon is killed. On top of that, the banks in the North were really getting nervous because they thought this was going to be a fast war. And they're all of a sudden kind of saying, are we backing the wrong horse in this thing? And on top of that, uh, London, England, and France were basically upset about the Trent affair and threatening to come into the war on the side of the South. The London Times actually published a newspaper account that said the Union was broken forever and the independence of the South is virtually assured. So, that was not a good look for the Union Army. The Army of the Potomac had gone into winter quarters, uh, without fighting again, which Lincoln was upset about. He wanted the Union Army to fight. But George McClellan, as good an organizer as he was not a fighter. On top of that, McClellan had come down with typhoid fever. And so you can imagine that didn't help it. Lincoln, as a result, folks, had fallen into a deep depression. If you know anything about Abraham Lincoln as a person, he suffered from depression most of his life. And he really suffered during the Civil War in many cases. The end of 1861 was one of his low points. It doesn't get any better, as we'll see in 1862. He really starts off the year really badly. There's a story that said he was visiting one of his trusted advisors and told him, "The bottom is out of the tub. What shall I do?" Well, as I've said, it only got worse as 1862 came. So that's it for the day. I hope you've learned something. I hope you've enjoyed it. I encourage you to keep learning, folks. I'm a champion of lifelong learning, and I think you guys need to learn something every day because it keeps the mind sharp. So we will see you next week, and hopefully, you'll be with me, and we will start 1862. So I will see you then. So long.